Welcome to Bevan, a femme over 40 and her friends podcast. I'm your host, Bevan. This is my friend, Sarah Lyn Rogers. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey.
Yay. I love to start business in the front on the podcast. So would you tell us how people can work with you and interact with you and benefit from your offerings?
Sure. So, in addition to being a writer, I'm an editor. I mostly do developmental edits, which is where I take a full-length manuscript and look at the big moving parts and pieces and think about how it's structured and how it might be reordered. I'm really into taking a look at what's already there, understanding the rules that the author has set and maybe isn't even very conscious of, and getting in there and deciding like, how can we make the book more of this? So I do big picture edits like that. I also do copy edits if you are wanting to work smaller picture on word choice, things like that. If you have about half a manuscript, I also offer a service where I will read what you have written and write a letter about how it might resolve based on the patterns I already see in it. I call that getting unstuck in the middle. And then for shorter, smaller offerings, I also do tarot readings about creative projects or not. And I can do advice calls, either like a short, general question, or if you want to send 10 to 15 pages of a sample of work, it could be a longer advice call where I've looked at the work and then we can hash it out together. And that's all on my website. It's sarahlynrogers.com.
Which is in the show notes. And you can clicky there or just write it out. And Sarah Lynn Rogers, for those who are not watching, spell Lynn.
Oh, it's just Lyn, just the one N. Sarah with an H, Lynn with one N, Rogers with no D.
I bet you get that. Rogers like Kenny. Um,
Not like Roy. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like Kenny, not Roy. I bet you've had to say that many times in your life.
Yeah. It's one of those names like people think they know how to spell it, so they don't look. Like even in emails, sometimes people respond and are like, "Hey, Sarah," which is fine. I totally get that. I can't tell you how many different ways there are to spell Kristen and how many ways I've ruined it. But now I check.
Listen, check every time. It's right there. I mean, spell my name, spell my name. It's right there in the email. As someone whose name is like constantly misspelled, it's fine. I'm like, whatever. Let's focus on human connection and not these other things. But it's one of those basics in like people skills is just getting people's names correct if you can.
We're
And
out here. We're trying.
we're trying. We're trying in these times, we're trying. Tell us about your book.
Yeah. So my first full-length poetry collection, Cosmic Tantrum, was released on February 15th by Northwestern University Press. They have a few imprints, but mine was put out on Curbstone Books. And my shorthand for it is that it's a tragicomic exploration of codependent and transactional relationships. So I'm looking at, I say, businesses run like families and families run like businesses. There are a couple of poems in here about bad roommates, bad bosses. And a question I had while writing it was, what is the degree to which I am complicit in my own suffering? So it's a lot of like implicating oneself or the speaker in, the relational problems, and looking at possible possible ways towards freedom and how play and wearing different masks might buy you an escape or the ability to get along for a while until you can change your circumstances.
Wow. Oh my God, that's very self-aware. Um, said it took you 10 years to write it.
Yeah, so there was an earlier version of this collection that I was sort of tinkering toward in 2014, 2015, 2016. And I reached a stage that I think lots of baby poets reach where you are suddenly aware that you like have enough poems that they could make a book, but they weren't necessarily written to go together. So I got excited about that, and I think I originally had some other different title. Maybe a kind of menacing title. I think it was We Are All Laughing at You. Um, and I sent that book around for a little while. I don't remember how many years ago, and it didn't get any bites. And I kind of go through these different phases as a writer. Probably other writers can relate. There's like the making the work, there's the sitting with the work, and then there's the submissions game where you are like sending it out. You have your spreadsheet. When are you going to hear back from people? It's been 6 months, they haven't responded to you. It's time to send out some more. So when I got myself out of submissions game uh, mind, I sat with the work again and I thought, oh, and by this time I had come up with the new collection title. I don't know how it came to me, but I found Cosmic Tantrum to be very sparkly and funny. And I had just appended it onto this other collection. And when I was reassessing, I was reading the poems and I thought that they weren't funny or biting enough to be worthy of this title. And I went through that old collection and was just really honest with myself about which poems didn't have any heat or energy for me anymore, even me, the person who made them. And I scrapped basically everything and started over in about 2020, 2021, 2022. And then I started sending it out again. And a thing I like to say about publishing is that it just takes one person to say yes to you. And that was my editor, Marissa Siegel at Northwestern. And she really saw the potential in the collection. She sent me this very ambiguous email at first that even I, as a former publishing industry person, couldn't quite parse out. And when I met with her, she was like, I love the collection, but, and I was like, oh, here it comes. But she was just asking, would you be willing to what? Would you be willing to write 5 to 10 more poems for it? And I said, hell yeah. So that's how this got born. Yeah, an odyssey of writing a little bit around full-time jobs and freelance stuff and many different iterations of myself over the years.
Man, writing is like one of the most torturous crafts that I participate in. And I don't even know like what's so torturous about it. You know what I mean? It's just so like it's I just must avoid it. You know what I mean? It's like the one that like teach aerobics, choreograph aerobics, I'm all in. But like writing is so
Yeah,
terrible. Like I don't know what it is about it, but it is my favorite thing to avoid.
I think it's the making something out of nothing, right? There's the blank page and there's well, for me, it's like I don't always know what I'm going to say until I already start to say it. And then once I'm seeing it in front of me, I can adjust it and, modify, reassess, step back. I can't do that so much in my speech, which I think is why I'm attracted to writing. I have lots of tries to like get it towards what I actually meant or what I'm realizing I meant through saying it.
Ooh, that's real. It's so interesting, like just observing ourselves and how we interact with these talents and gifts that we've been given. Because I think, you know what I mean? Like just like watching the artistic process happen as you're doing it or avoiding doing it and
Yeah.
figuring all that out. What I'm curious what the 5 to 10 new poems were. Did she have an idea what like she wanted, like subjects, or was it more like I just
No, it's funny. So yeah, I think you're asking a question like a developmental editor would, right? Like, oh, I see these themes here, and like, how can you bridge them, right? But really, this was more just a practical question. This press wants their books, their full-length collections to be over a certain number of pages because they're also going to have half-length collections, chapbooks at some point in the future, and they want them to be distinct from each other. So it was just kind of a numbers game. But it was funny, I had already written a new poem, which I ended up using as the dedication for the book. So when she asked, I was like, well, I do have one more. So then I took it upon myself to go through the text and see, like, what are some things I had meant to say in the collection, perhaps, that I didn't get around to? What are some earlier drafts that feel in the same world, but that I scrapped? Can I repurpose them for some reason? And then also because this is a university press, my book did go through peer review like an academic book would. And instead of being very stringent about research, they just found another contemporary poet to read the collection anonymously and give anonymous feedback. Um, and this person basically was excited about the collection, and her only real question was she wasn't quite sure what all the Grey Gardens poems were doing in there or what they had to do with the other overarching themes. So one of the new poems I wrote is called Genre Study, and it's more explicitly talking about how I think of little Edie from Grey Gardens as a tragic heroine and sort of her life as like a cautionary tale and placing it in this lens of like fairy tales and myths that I'm viewing a lot of life from. I'm really interested in this idea that all we have about ourselves and other people are narratives, and we can sort of get trapped in those narratives and believe that that's like a capital T truth. But we can also change our minds about what our personal narrative is, and see things from other perspectives and understand like people have their own reasons for doing things. Like no one's really a villain necessarily. No one's a villain in their own story.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure. Um, what is little Edie's cautionary tale if you were to like snip it?
Oh, well, okay, so I'm working on this essay right now, sort of thinking about like there's a continuum from Gilmore Girls to Grey Gardens, where it's like a very close mother-daughter relationship. And in Gilmore Girls, there seems to be some codependency, but they're like basically basically charming, basically functional women who are adored in their world, and we're supposed to watch them and admire their relationship, like, oh, it's so great to be best friends with your parent. But then I see Grey Gardens as the other end of this continuum where it's like, oh, it could actually potentially require you to sacrifice your life if you were such close friends with your mother that she was all you had in the world. Or like, conversely, if your daughter was the only person you could depend on. So I see, the intense isolation of their lives at Grey Gardens as this like the most literal representation of the idea that you're my whole world. People say that in a very romantic way sometimes, but it always gives me the creeps because I think it's asking too much of anyone to be your whole world. Right? They're your savior, they're also your antagonist. It's too much. So that's my cautionary tale. It seemed like Edie had a lot of wanderlust. She wanted to be a performer. She wanted to live in New York, but her mother who decided to live in a mansion she could no longer afford after she got divorced, needed basically somebody to take care of her, and Edie was willing. And she lived for over 25 years in a house with just her mom. So yeah, that's something I've watched that film many times, and I always find new things in it that I find like heartwarming and also so devastating. Yeah, so I have a whole series of poems in here. A lot of them were written after the first time I'd watched the movie, maybe 6 years ago, and was trying to understand like what is it about them? Like there's some deep dynamic that parts of me recognize. It's hard to put into words. What is it that they want from each other? What is it that they're making each other into to get their needs met? Yeah, so I have a bunch of different Grey Gardens poems in this collection, trying to figure it out.
Oh, and I love that you're like contrasting it to Gilmore Girls. I think like where Gilmore Girls goes right is like Lorelai's like aversion to home care and like food preparation. So like it forces her and Rory to go out and be in
Uh-huh.
community in a way where like the Edie's were not out.
Right. And it's also like different rights for women available at different times, right? Like with Grey Gardens, I'm thinking about how the Edie's didn't drive, they don't own a car. It was a time before women could even have their own checking accounts. So they were very limited in a way that Lorelai and Rory were not.
Yeah. Oh, but it really is like it does lend both of them having the same name. Like it really there is a lot of
Yes.
parallel there to think
That's
about.
another part of the essay where I'm like, oh, it's so explicit. Like, you're another me is like an element of naming somebody after yourself, and how that could be flattering, charming, or also scary.
Yeah. It's, yeah, it's stunning. Okay, this is a great break to talk about our sponsor for this episode. The sponsor of my podcast are my Patreon supporters. Patreon, patreon.com/FKDP, which stands for Fat Kid Dance Party, which is my aerobics class for anyone who feels left behind by mainstream fitness. If you've ever been called too much, too fat, or felt too awkward to dance, mine is the supportive class for you. The Patreon, I can draw a direct line to everything I'm creating artistically today to the support that I've received from my Patreon. And I'm so grateful to everyone, past, present, and future, who has joined. And if membership is not your deal, you can also go in and buy access to individual aerobics classes. I have a series of Patreon pep talks. So if you just, want my help, like on a bad body image day, or I'm just posting one now that's about like missing out and like just a pep talk about when you're actually missing out on something. Um, Friendship loss, well, all sorts of things. I'm just here to help you walk through the uncertainties of life because it's full of them. And I'm just here to create a space that helps living be a little bit easier for all of us. So patreon.com/FKDP and back to the show. I'm experimenting with doing my own sponsored
I
interruptions.
love it.
There,
Yeah.
how'd I do?
You did great.
um, Okay, let's talk about becoming a writer. Like, were you always like an artistic kid? Was this something where like you had to claim artist as something you did away from this idea that like I had a moment where I had to be like, I am an artist, I am a writer, and they were like major identity formations in my late 20s and 30s. So
Yeah.
curious for you, like what was your arc?
Um, it's interesting because for me it feels like a two-part thing. I definitely always dabbled in arts as a kid. I liked painting and drawing. I got very into MS Paint art when I was like 8 years old. Um, and I always kept a journal. I don't know that I really wrote creatively, like made things from nothing until I was a little older, but I always like kept a journal. I kept a Zanga, I kept a live journal, various blogs over the years. Um, so there's a way in which I thought of myself as an artist, as in like one who creates things, right? I have some technical skills, I can make something from nothing. But something that was happening when I was in my early 20s and I was taking creative writing classes at school, I minored in that. And then I, I have half of an MFA, was I felt like I had all the little tools in my toolkit, but I wasn't sure what I was writing about. I wasn't sure how to, I don't know, look inside myself and figure out what was really important and mattered to me. So a lot of what I was writing when I was writing short stories for fiction classes were like slightly transformed versions of real life events. And they were all pretty small. Like I was basically somebody who had followed a lot of directions from authority figures. I went to school, I went to work. I didn't really have very much life to be writing about. So, kind of partly what this book is about for me is that I felt like I had to change my relationship to myself to be a real artist. And by that, I mean like an autonomous person who doesn't belong to other people. I think if you're used to following directions and being compliant and polite, it's possible to make something like art, you know? But for me, I haven't, I wrote a couple little chapbooks before this. I feel like it's possible to sort of hide and disguise yourself in poetry because partly because not so many people read it. People who read it don't necessarily know what it's literally about, if it's literally about anything. And also because poetry has this conceit of the speaker, right? Like I wrote all these poems, but I'm not necessarily the narrator of all these poems. I have a bunch of persona poems in here to and from a local beast. I have some like mean guided meditations from a mystery voice. Um,
Teen guided
anyway,
meditation?
yeah, I have one called Guided Meditation with Mean Voice, which is kind of my joke about having like an internal critic that came from somewhere that's running in the background. Yeah, so I feel like I had to identify where and whom I was taking orders from, and stop doing that. Or, feel like it's okay to be disapproved of or to not just do the pretty thing.
Mm.
Yeah.
And to give yourself your own orders, you know? I love that you
Yeah.
find art as just being an autonomous person because like that's really that voice of the artist is this like unique thing that comes through each person. Like I'm a big proponent and I talk about this in aerobics a lot is that I believe every human is different by design. Like we are raised in these systems that prize homogeny and conformity and that takes us outside of who we really are. But if we actually each and every one of us embodied who we are and like even came close to a scrap of our potential, because I think that we're really wired for mediocrity. Like if we could
Yeah.
get close to our a scrap of our potential, we could solve all of the world's problems. Like I think all of us are different by design because we are meant to help this evolving world, and the world is evolving so fast that it
Yeah.
tracks to me that like now we have like far more neurodivergence and far more like we can just witness more differences amongst
Yeah.
because we need it.
Yeah, for sure. My title poem in this collection is called Cosmic Tantrum, and it's partly about I had this sort of Devil Wears Prada year where I was an executive assistant, and it felt like I could do everything they asked me to do at the last minute under ridiculous circumstances, um, operate at a high level, and I was miserable because there was never any endpoint. So the cosmic tantrum that I was having was basically this idea that like I can be whatever you ask me. I can do it. And it's never enough. And realizing like what I was mad at was that I had to contort myself into these different things that other people wanted and needed instead of, I mean, obviously there's the whole have to make money component. But I felt like I was doing that everywhere in my life. And I was angry that um I felt like I was so good at responding to the call, doing the thing, that there maybe wasn't even a person on the inside who was a real person with her own like wants and needs. Um, and how much work I was going to have to do to start over from scratch at that when other people have been allowed to do it in various ways throughout their lives, maybe people I worked for example.
Yeah. I think I want to just highlight this as a teaching point, like starting over from scratch. You mentioned that you have half an MFA, and I want to talk about that because
Uh-huh.
like, I think it's so boss to recognize when something is not in alignment and to stop, even when
Right.
we're because I realized during my first semester of my second year of law school, it's a 3-year program, that
Hmm.
I was like, oh my God, we are playing chess with people's lives. This is
Hmm.
really fucked up. I don't think I want to be a lawyer. I knew that. I had that clarity. And I was like, well, shit, I'm like 60 grand into this degree. Like, what
Yeah.
am I going to do? You know what I mean? Like, I'm in all this debt, crippling debt,
Right.
and you know what? Still have that debt. Practiced as a lawyer for like almost 15 years. Still
But
have
imagine if
that
you
debt.
completed it, you'd have even more.
Yeah, yeah, and I did complete it and I did have all the
Oh,
and then I practiced, but like I didn't ever practice at the level where you could pay it off, and
yeah.
it was just one of those things where like I wish like God, I wish I never went to law school. I wish I could go back and drop out of law school when I had that clarity, but I didn't have the guts to live with the uncertainty of it. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm curious for you, like you did half an MFA, and then
Yeah.
what was your clarity moment, and like how did
Mm.
you like talk yourself into making the choice that was in alignment for you?
It wasn't one specific moment. Um, I had gone to the MFA program immediately after graduating from undergrad, so I didn't like sometimes people take a gap and they live real lives and have life experiences. But I was so afraid that if I no longer had classes asking me to turn things in, I would simply not create work anymore. Partly because I had seen that happen to friends who had graduated. So
So you were
I
going to grad school for an accountability buddy.
basically, yeah. Um,
Clarity.
yeah, I'm neurodivergent. I didn't know that about myself until recently, but I did always know that I had to have like deadlines and stop gaps and all this stuff to make myself do things, even things that I wanted to do. Um, yeah, and then I think there are I think that if I could go back, a way to strategize about doing MFA or college at all is like, what city might I want to be in? Where do I want to already be making connections for where I want to end up? But instead of doing that, I just went to the state school that I had graduated from, where I lived. I was dating my now husband. He was a year behind me at school, so that was part of it. But um, yeah, I took classes, and the sort of the workshop model these days is that the author is a fly on the wall when they turn their stuff in. They're not allowed to talk. And while I respect that on the one hand, like when I'm editing somebody else's work, I can't stop and ask them to clarify, what did you mean by this? But what kind of killed me was, well, all the feedback comes from your peers who don't have any more or less experience than you have. And they all have their own soapboxes or hills that they want to die on. Like some people are very into setting and they're like very caught up in the fact that you didn't explain everything that's happening in the setting to the degree that they would want it. And they would waste your entire 10-minute slot talking about that. And you wouldn't be allowed to jump in and be like, can you tell me about the characters that I wrote? So there are things I got out of the program, but I did a whole year. I actually took too many like they told me I shouldn't have taken a full load of classes so that there's time to do whatever, but I was working and helping to pay for my tuition, and I didn't want the stuff to take any longer than it was supposed to. So at the end of the first year, I thought I need to take a break. I need to read some actual recently published books. Like we were reading Moby Dick, which is a lovely book. I like that one, but I felt, I'm going to say correctly, that to participate in the publishing world, I needed to have more literacy about books that are out right now. Like we were writing short stories for class, but not reading any contemporary short stories. There was this disconnect between like what we were studying in the reading classes and the work we were turning in. And I thought, I do not have enough of a handle on contemporary literature to be in conversation with it myself. I want to read more books. I want to read more poetry. Um, and I want to make some money. So I decided to take a break and look for a full-time job for the first time. I did that for a while, didn't love it. And then my husband, who by this time had graduated, was offered a strange opportunity to work for 1 year at a Western classical music school in Bhutan. And I was like, hell yeah, I hate this tech job that I have. I'll go anywhere else. So we went there. The cost of living was very small. I had a little bit of freelance work that I was finishing up for the place I used to work. And I was kind of the homemaker for the year that we lived there, which I think would have bored me over a longer period of time. But it gave me a lot of space and time to work on writing. And that's when I published my first chapbook. Where was I going with this? Oh, so then I simply never went back to the MFA program. Like I thought that I was going to take a break and come back, but then I didn't want to. I cobbled my literary life together in other ways, and it seems like that has been just fine.
I love it. Bhutan, I did not know this about you. I love that you lived in Bhutan.
Surprise. My dog is from Bhutan. That's where I got Ginger. She was a street dog.
You adopted a street dog from Bhutan and brought it back to
Mhm.
New York City.
She had mange, and I felt sorry for her, so we were taking care of her. And then a couple months before we were supposed to come back home, I was like, can't leave this dog here. So I got her little dog passport with all her vaccines and flew her as luggage because she was too big to fly. And then I promised her I'd never make her fly on a plane again. And when we moved to New York from California, we did a road trip.
Wow, really. Flying is a lot. Um, Flying is a lot for human bodies, I can.
Mhm.
Oh my God. Okay. Bhutan has the highest like gross
They
happiness.
have they measure gross national happiness in
Yeah.
addition to gross domestic product. But measure is a strong word. I think they do surveys. We got to go to the Gross National Happiness Conference, and basically every speech from invited academics was like, Bhutan is so lucky to be a Buddhist country where everyone is naturally good. And that was the extent of the research.
Oh,
So take from that what you will. But it was an interesting year, and I'm glad that I went.
were you happy?
Um, Kind of. I feel like it was more interesting than gratifying. Like basic things were hard to do. We didn't have a car. We were located at 7,500 feet above sea level. Everything was mountainous. So if I wanted to get groceries, I walked downtown to the market and then carried, a bag of rice and produce and stuff just up like a 45-minute walk up to our apartment. That kind of stuff. Didn't have a washing machine. You'd like barter with friends, be like, I'll bring my vacuum like a Ghostbuster backpack to your apartment if you will let me use your washing machine. And then you put it in luggage and roll it through the town. Yeah, so it was like a kind of labor intensive year, but I am grateful that I got to spend all that time like working with my hands and my body in a way that I hadn't because I had worked at a tech startup before this. I was working for like an online education company where I revoiced content to make it funny and also make sure it met Common Core standards. So it was a lot of just like being in an office with, I don't know, yeah, an office that smells like stale pizza and working with like remote contract writers and I don't know. The arbitrariness of like your butt has to be in this seat for 40 hours and then do as much work as like there seemed to be no guideline about like what's a reasonable number of projects to be working on at any given time. Like that was wild to me. It's like, you want me to do more stuff? I don't know. Tell a story in order in a linear way about this experience? No thanks. Yeah, so I was tired of living on a computer, and I'm glad that I got to, I don't know, hand wash dishes and laundry sometimes, and I felt like that let me get more into my own head. Like most of my writing doesn't happen on a page, it happens just like idly thinking about stuff and making connections in the back of my mind. So I got to do a lot of that. And that's also the year that I learned tarot. I signed up for this course called Brooklyn Fools, taught by Jeff Hinshaw, and it was the first virtual one. So I was mostly not having a virtual year, but every week for almost 6 months, I signed in and we did a different major arcana card and kind of lived as that card um, for the week until next time. So it was a pretty transformative year for me. I'm glad.
Oh, that sounds like a really great place to be to study tarot. Because like it is, I've been doing with Jana of Feeling Loudly. She does Meet the Majors and Meet the Minors
Mhm.
tarot class, and she does it daily. So like we're about to start
Okay,
the Suit of Cups, and so each day we'll have a we start on the Pisces new moon, which is I think 2 days from now. So each day we have like
cool.
a card that we study, and we kind of just like embody the card for the day and like look for the serendipities and hearing more from the universe about the tarot card than like from a book. And I
Mhm.
think that's like because to most mysticism is better embodied than it is like studied in an academic way. Although
Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah, of course, there's still patterns and things to pick up on. Have you read the Octavia Butler Pattern Master series?
No,
I think you would
sounds
like.
like I should. I
Yeah,
gotta
based
write it
on like
down.
how you edit and like what you offer people and the way you think and the way your brain works, I think you would really like it. It's 4 books. I just finished it and I can't stop thinking about it. It's like really changed, I think, the way I see the world. And like and I'm kind of understanding like there's this thing called a pattern. It's this metaphysical connection between various telepathic people.
Mhm.
But I also kind of think of like the pattern is astrology, and like the ways
Mhm.
in which like when we're born kind of creates a soul path for us and like a person.
Yeah,
Um anyway, so now I'm thinking about that in all things. And so anyway, that's my
I
suggestion
love.
to you and anyone listening is to
Thank you.
read that series. It's actually I've heard it's a really good series to start an Octavia Butler journey on. Because
Okay.
it begins with the book Wild Seed. Um
Yeah.
although I've read other Octavia Butler books before this. So yeah.
Sweet. Thank you.
Um, but back to you. You live in New York City.
I do.
What do you love about living in New York City? And as a metaphysical cutie, do you find it hard, especially compared to living in Bhutan?
Yeah, I love the people I meet in New York City. Like I have very cool friends here. My joke about the Bay Area where I'm from is that everyone's busy, but no one's doing anything. Whereas people I meet in New York, like one of my first jobs here was a temp job. I met two other writers. So it's like we're all doing our 9 to 5s, and then we do have like a dream and a side hustle that's not like creating an app. Not that that's not an art, but that's the only thing anyone wants to talk about Bay Area, it feels like. Um, so yeah, I'm grateful for all the artists I've met over here, and just people seem to want to make things happen, and if they don't see it happening around them, they'll make it happen themselves. Um, my husband's making a short film, so there's whole worlds over here that I feel like I didn't quite have access to, or that people were not as serious about in California. But city life is hard for me. I'm a highly sensitive person. I'm a projector, so basically a human design projector. So basically all of my body's centers are open. Yeah. So I have like the mental emotional thing about like, uh-oh, I better jump out of the way of whoever's coming on the sidewalk or they're gonna think that I'm rude. And like there's thousands of people you walk by on the sidewalk every day, so it's very tiring. And then I don't know, yeah, sensitive to the energies of a room. It's hard for me to be in an apartment. I can hear other people's music, smell their cooking. Like I feel like I'm never quite like secluded enough to recharge in the way that I would want to. So I don't really know if it's in the cards for me to be here forever, but it's been useful and encouraging to be here at this stage in my life.
How old
Been
are you?
here since 2018. I'm 34. I'm almost 35. Yeah.
Um, when I was living in New York, I lived there for about 12 years, and I knew it wasn't forever. And I knew I had to leave the city like once a month for self-care to just like, be secluded enough to recharge. And I also like, it's so interesting how embodied I am now that like I notice like, if I had a bag over my shoulder, I would totally notice like where the bag is going, where my body is, right? And
Mhm.
in New York, in order to live there, I was so dissociated from my body.
Yeah.
That, like I wasn't spatially aware of the fact that like I would sometimes accidentally hit people with a bag. You know what I mean?
Okay.
I just
Yeah.
so checked out because like that's how you have to, that's how I could survive. Like I don't know if that was like being a metaphysical cutie and just like trying to
Mhm.
survive, because I wasn't aware of this stuff. And as I became more aware of like psychic bodies and energetic bodies and things like that, I was in my sunset times in New York. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
I can actually be, this is a very bad idea. Okay. Like as I started learning more about it, I was like, oh, and
Yeah.
it's been so good for me because like living away from New York now, I can like really allow my sensitivity to be so heightened, which like
Mhm.
I think is only beneficial for me. But it's so interesting when I think back to living in New York and like how I had to survive there. Um,
Yeah.
and like, just the spatial awareness of being on a sidewalk with a bunch of people all at the same
Yeah,
time.
I'm always thinking about it.
Yeah.
But I don't think everybody else is. Like, I definitely,
Yeah.
a guy who worked at the interior design firm where I was an EA was like, that sort of magical thing where people are approaching towards you on the sidewalk and somehow everyone finds their way. And I was like, oh, honey, like, it feels magical to you because you're the one who doesn't move and everybody else like has to accommodate
Yeah.
you. I'm working for both of us if we're both on the sidewalk at the same time.
Yeah.
That's my silly little example. I think I used to be better at it because I had no choice. Pre-pandemic, I had like a go to the office every day job, and I was like in the commute time, like rush hour, packed like a sardine in the subway. And then nobody was taking the subway for a little while. And it's been much harder for me to get back into it. Like I basically try to plan my life so that I'm running errands at odd hours when other people are not doing it. But once in a while, if I'm like going to an event in the evening or, stay out longer than I meant to, then it's rush hour time. And I like, people are going to be how close to me? Or like trains will come by and I'll peek in and I'll be like, I'm just going to wait 8 minutes and see if the next one is better. I don't want anyone to touch me right now. I simply can't handle that. Um,
Oh,
yeah, it's harder now.
Sarah, I did stuff like that all the time in New York.
Yeah.
If I had time, I'd make time. You know what I mean? Like I just was like, oh, the packed like a sardine thing. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, I get it.
Not
And
that anyone likes it, but sometimes I'm like, oh my God, I don't know how I could bring myself to do this.
I think some people just live in a rush all the time. I mean, and I say that because I used to live in a rush all the time and I don't rush anymore. Like that's like
Yeah.
there's a lot of ways to experience wealth, I think. And there's like a luxury in like not putting so much on your plate that you have to be in a rush to do everything, you know? And like
Yeah.
there's an abundance mentality in recognizing 8 minutes, you know, like I'll read a
Yeah.
little more in my book and wait.
I think I also used to be much more dissociated, as you've mentioned. And like as I, you know, do my work and excavate things and learn more about myself and decide to be here more, I don't have all the escape routes I used to have, and it's harder for me. Like, yeah, I used to be able to just adapt to whatever the environment is and be like, I guess this is what's happening. But the older I get, the more like I need the environment to be different. I need to find a different environment. I can't make myself jump through hoops
Yeah.
like that anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, speaking of jumping through hoops, Cosmic Tantrum is about transactional relationships. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm really hot for the idea of like interdependent relationships and like relational relationships where like we like Mars just stationed direct in Cancer. And so I'm thinking a lot about like how can we perform as family for one another, especially
Yeah.
so many of us have like family of origin that, you know, kind of falls short. Uh,
Yeah.
and we didn't come here to fix a broken world. We came here to create the world of our dreams, right? And so
Mhm.
you talk more about like what revealed transactional relationships to you and like what are you pursuing in
Ooh.
relationships from like a more healing space?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it goes back to that Devil Wears Prada year where like it was literally like I had to do everything for these men. It was two co-owners of the company. I was their assistant. So like at one point I asked my friend Bailey who also worked, I was like, why do they trust that I will be able to get them a visa to Hong Kong? Like nobody trained me to do that. Like why do they think I'll be able to make this happen? And she basically said, well, they're paying you to do it. So I was like, that doesn't explain to me why they have trust. But it was this idea that like they're giving you money, so you better figure something out or else goodbye.
Yeah.
And I realized that that was sort of like a dynamic I'd been familiar with my whole life from family stuff and kind of school stuff. It felt like this same template playing out everywhere. I also had a difficult roommate situation earlier in my New York life where I was the only person with a full-time job, but somebody else who lived in the apartment made like 3 times as much money as me, working 3 days a week. And this person seemed to feel comfortable making me feel as though I didn't belong. And it felt to me like like, oh, you left your jacket here. It's like, did I? I'm the only one working all the time. Um, or like it's your turn to buy the coffee grounds, but wouldn't say that to me, would just give me the silent treatment until I bought coffee grounds without ever like that kind of thing. So it felt to me like, oh, people who are comfortable treating me this way do it because they know only I have something to lose. Like if I had to leave this apartment because my relationship got bad enough with this person could still afford to live here without me. I could not afford to live here without this other person. So it felt clear to me that people who have more resources feel, mm, I don't know, comfortable submitting you to these bizarre tests. If you're a kid, maybe it's like, oh, you weren't polite enough. You don't get this thing that you want. Oh, if you're not good enough, I'm gonna stop bringing you to your after school activity that you want. It's not like I'm not gonna feed you, but it's like you behave this way because I hold the keys and I decide what you do. And it felt to me like, you know, having a boss, you have to basically do intimate favors for. Like I was buying people's like linens for their guests. I'm crawling under their desk to look for their wallet that they can't find. Just like it felt like there was a kind of intimacy I had with these men who were in charge of me and could throw me away if they wanted, and how familiar that felt in various ways. And apartment hunting in New York is terrible. We had a pretty awful experience last year where we almost didn't have an apartment because we were leaving. You only have 1 month between like saying, I'm gonna leave this one and I gotta find a new one. Where the, you know, bratty little broker we got coerced into having just like wouldn't communicate, like didn't really give us the new contract for the place that we were supposed to move into until 5 days before we were supposed to move into it when the lease was almost up at our other place. And I just thought, if I had 10 times as much money, nobody would treat me this way because they would feel afraid of being sued, right? So there's this like I feel hyper aware of the way that people are sizing each other up all the time about how much influence, power, and money they have. And as a result, the ways they can get away with treating you. Whereas I don't want to do that to people. Um, and I think one of my fears is that if I ever did have a lot of money, I would become somebody who thinks in this terrible way. I'd like to think that's not true, but I'm gonna need more examples of people who do well. I need more Dolly Partons, people who use their money for good and don't use it as an excuse to be like, I'm safe. Let's see some certain behaviors from you and decide if you're safe.
Yeah.
That's what it is for me.
I have to say, I've understood money. I didn't understand this growing up, but I've understood it now, later in life, thanks to meeting some great people who actually have a really strong people ethic. Uh,
Yeah.
and like that money is simply a character revealer, just like fame is a
Oh,
character.
like a Rorschach test kind of.
Yeah, it's like because there are people who are terrible people who are poor, and there are people who are wildly generous people who are poor, and like
Yeah.
it doesn't have to do with anything other than just revealing character, right? And so like if
Yeah.
gets a lot of money and uses it as an excuse to treat people like garbage versus like it doesn't make any sense to me that Jeffrey Bezos, who has everyone's address and everyone's Amazon wish list, isn't like pulling off Santa Claus.
Woo! You get a this, you get a that.
Like instead of
Like
buying
that.
your third yacht, like why don't you like just fulfill some dreams? Like I
Yeah.
think that would be the coolest thing. And like when Dolly Parton was getting rich, she did so much work to figure out how she could make things easier for people in her hometown. And she reverse
Yeah.
engineered her book Dream More talks about this. Like she reverse engineered what it would take to keep people from dropping out of high school. And it turned
Uh-huh.
out it was early childhood literacy. So now she
Oh,
sent
right. She has the free books program.
Yep, the Imagination Library. So she funds the chapter in her home county, and then she funds the infrastructure. So basically, like, individual like groups get together and like create the chapters in their counties, and
Yeah.
the Imagination Library gets the books for like 250 each, and so they pay for the children in those counties. But basically, she's doing a lot and funneling a lot. I mean, she's a millionaire, not a billionaire, because she gives
Yeah.
and I think it's really being in the spirit of being a river, not a reservoir, and
Mm.
figuring out how you can do that where you're at right now and not need to have well, when I have money or when I have the right body or when I'm in the right relationship, right? Like instead of
Yeah.
those things, getting into your generosity flow right now.
Yeah. I think that I try to do it by connecting people to each other. Like, oh, well, it feels related to the editing thing. It's like, oh, I see this person does this kind of thing, and they're looking for this person who does this kind of thing. They should talk to each other. I can introduce them.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
natural connector. Okay, I'm gonna wrap this up by reminding everyone Sarah Lynn Rogers' new book, Cosmic Tantrum, is out now. You too can have a cosmic tantrum and read some poetry. And also check the link in the show notes, sarahlynrogers.com, for if you are a writer with a story locked up inside you or half I'm like I want to say half vomited out, but that's so gross. Um, but a half finished manuscript, as many of us do. It's so funny. I have a 90% finished manuscript, and then
You're so close.
and yet I don't want to publish it. So I'm like, I'm glad I did the writing of it because I needed the revelations. I was
Mm.
actually your age when I wrote it, and I needed those revelations so I could give up drinking because I realized
Mhm.
objectively I had a great run. I have some great stories, but I don't think I was compassionate enough at the time to have written that as a memoir that other people would read. So
Okay.
someday I'll go through and I'll
Yeah. It's always there waiting for you when you want it.
exactly. And I don't feel bad about it. For a long time, I felt like really incomplete and bad about it, but I don't feel bad about it now. I'm just trusting the
Good.
whatever I'm supposed to create at the time. But you're like a doula for people's writing.
Yeah, it does sort of feel like energy work or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing and being on the podcast and just looking so fly. If you're not watching the video, yes, you're really missing this beautiful desert witch cosmic jacket with like, Sonoran cacti and this beautiful headpiece. I love it. I love it.
Thanks for having me, Bevan. It was a pleasure.